lower costs. That's what small business owners need on the health care front.
Thank you very much for being here. Sorry about the quick end here, but we hope you'll come back again as the small business discussion continues. House of Representatives now in session. They're going to continue the budget discussions. Thanks for being with us on this Friday.
And move together to propose a common response to the overall security of your people. Integrate the information of this age with the practical and ethical standards that have guided your people always, through the mysteries of nature and the multiple legitimate needs of the most vulnerable in our midst. Enlighten the nation with your word and your grace, both now and forever. Amen.
The chair has examined the journal of the last day's proceedings and announces to the House his approval thereof, and pursuant to Clause 1 of Rule 1, the journal stands approved. The Pledge of Allegiance this morning will be led by the gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Price.
Please join me in the pledge. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
The chair will entertain up to 5 one-minute requests on each side. For what purpose does the gentleman from South Carolina rise?
Mr. Speaker, I ask permission to address the House 1 minute revised and extend my remarks.
Without objection.
Mr. Speaker, yesterday marked the gruesome second anniversary of the administration's misnamed stimulus plan. When this irresponsible plan of massive spending was introduced, liberals promised unemployment would not exceed 8%. At that time, House Republicans, led by John Boehner, explained that our nation cannot borrow and spend our way to prosperity, and the failure of this stimulus plan is a sad reminder of this. Now, 2 years later, taxpayers have more than $817 billion added to the national debt. Unemployment is still above 9% and has been above 9% for 21 straight months. That means 14 million Americans are without jobs. Our debt is over $14 trillion. I have introduced legislation for an audit of the stimulus to show the American people where their tax dollars were spent. Where is the money? Where are the jobs? In conclusion, God bless our troops, and we will never forget September 11th and the global war on terrorism.
For what purpose the gentleman from Florida rise? Without objection.
Mr. Speaker, this week my Republican colleagues offered us a glimpse into their vision for America. It is a country where millions of women are turned away from basic health care, where the wealthy can buy access to our courts and the poor are denied justice, where we abandon our obligation to pass on a cleaner, safer world to the next generation, where the voices of 1,000 workers' cries for better treatment fall on a few pairs of deaf ears, where we deny children the arts education that has helped inspire the greatest culture on earth. This is not the America envisioned by the constituents I serve. Among them, thousands of America's greatest generation who fought during World War II and built an extraordinary nation after the Great Depression. This continuing resolution is quite simply a disgrace to their vision and to their sacrifice. We can do better. We must do better. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. For what purpose the gentleman from Texas rise?
Request permission to address the House for 1 minute.
Gentleman is recognized for a minute.
Mr. Speaker, last year the military received over 3,000 reports of sexual assault involving other members in the service. This week, 17 veterans are saying that the military ignored their cases of sexual assault while they were on active duty. These accusations have occurred in all branches of the military. The most recent complaint came from a woman who says she was drugged and gang raped by 2 fellow members of the Navy. This ended her career. Another rape victim reported the crime to the Marines, and she was ordered not to tell anyone and to respect the alleged rapist, who was of a higher rank. The perpetrators of rape in the military must be held accountable for their misdeeds, and victims should be respected and validated by the military. The United States has the world's finest military personnel, and we must support all of them, including victims of crime. And that's just the way it is. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. For what purpose the gentleman from Washington rise? Gentleman is recognized for a minute.
Mr. Speaker, I come to the floor to warn my colleagues and the American public of a nasty little amendment in this CR. An amendment will be offered by the Republicans today to eliminate the ability of the Environmental Protection Agency to enforce the clear mandates of the Clean Air Act. The Supreme Court has ruled that the EPA owes the American public an obligation to reduce certain of these dangerous toxic gases, and yet, incredibly, the Republican Party wants to eliminate the ability to enforce that bill. Now, I think of this amendment as the Dirty Air Act, and it is the Dirty Air Act because if they pass it, that's what we'll get is dirty air. Now, Americans, and I want to warn my colleagues, a poll distributed by the American Lung Association shows Americans are adamantly opposed to this amendment. They know we want clean air. They know we don't want more children's asthma, and we got to defeat this amendment, defeat the Dirty Air Act, keep the Clean Air Act as law of this country.
For what purpose, the gentleman from Minnesota? Gentleman from Minnesota, rise. Without objection, you're recognized for 1 minute.
Mr. Speaker, listen to the people. Kindergarten teachers, not a group easily riled, are amongst 30,000 of their neighbors in Wisconsin at the state capitol. The audacity of their demand, the ability to negotiate a living wage, safe working conditions, and a dignified retirement. These public servants make our society safe and functioning at an average wage of $30,000 a year. They did not cause the financial catastrophe in this country. That was the speculators and robber barons who received billions in TARP funds and then offsourced it to avoid paying taxes. The folks in Wisconsin who are rallying, teach our children to read. In a time of AstroTurf rallies, I urge all my colleagues, listen to that sound coming like a warm spring breeze off the prairie. That's the sound of America's proud middle class that built this country, and they have found their voice. We would all be wise. Listen to the people. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The other gentleman from Minnesota, for what purpose does he rise?
1 minute.
Gentleman is recognized for a minute.
Mr. Speaker, I come to the floor today to talk about the CR in larger context. What's going on? The American people have been watching us debating this stuff for days now, late into the night. What is it all about? What it's all about, Mr. Speaker, is which direction will America go in? Will we cut back and scale back vital programs that help Americans do better and move into the middle class? Will we cut back and scale back vitally needed regulations to help protect us, allow us to have clean air and clean water and important other rights? Or, Mr. Speaker, will we have an America where we have labor rights, where we can organize, where we can have adequate regulations that give us the opportunity to have a decent standard of life in America? It is a stark choice, a dim view where the vision is a small number of really wealthy people and a vast number of really desperate people, or a large, robust, strong middle class which powers America into the future. What we're fighting about is the soul of this country, the direction of this country, and the Democratic caucus is standing firmly with the people as we've seen the people of Wisconsin stand up and snatch back their destiny from somebody who would take it from them. So, Mr. Speaker, today, focus your attention. The people are rising up around America, and the Democratic caucus is standing strong right here.
Time has expired. For what purpose does the gentleman from New Jersey rise? California, then. Without objection, so ordered. She is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, our budget is a serious document and a statement of our values as a union. Americans are depending on us to reduce the deficit in a responsible manner while growing our economy and putting people back to work. But as their so be it, let them eat cake approach to jobs and the economy shows, the Republican colleagues have chosen to abandon the responsibility for recklessness. Now the Republicans are proposing to wipe out the California salmon industry and the thousands of jobs that depend on it. California's fishermen just made it through 3 years of unprecedented slowdown in the salmon industry. An estimated 23,000 jobs and $2.8 billion have been lost in just the last 3 years. These latest proposals threaten water supplies for millions, including both fishermen and farmers. Mr. Speaker, salmon means jobs. I have met the people who make their living with salmon, and they are proud of their jobs. According to recent studies, restoring the California Bay Delta could provide 94,000 new jobs and $5.7 billion in economic activity. I yield back.
Gentlelady's time has expired. Pursuant to House Resolution 92 and Rule 18, the Chair declares the House in the Committee of the Whole House on the State of the Union for further consideration of H.R. 1. Will the gentleman from Utah, Mr. Bishop, kindly resume the chair?
The House is in Committee of the Whole on the State of the Union for further consideration of H.R. 1, which the clerk will report by title.
A bill making appropriations for the Department of Defense and the other departments and agencies of the government for the fiscal year ending September 30th, 2011, and for other purposes.
When the Committee of the Whole rose on the legislative day of Thursday, February 17, 2011, a request for a recorded vote on Amendment Number 466, printed in the Congressional Record, was offered by the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Poe, has been postponed, and the bill has been read through page 359, line 22. For what purpose does the gentleman from Montana rise?
I have an amendment at the desk, number 575.
Clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment number 575, printed in the Congressional Record, offered by Mr. Rehberg of Montana.
For what purpose does the gentlelady from Connecticut rise?
Mr. Chairman, I rise to make a point of order on the amendment.
Gentlelady will state her point.
Chairman, I make a point of order against the Rehberg amendment because it violates Clause 3J3 of House Resolution 5 by proposing a net increase in budget authority in the bill. According to a cost estimate received from the Congressional Budget Office of the Rehberg amendment would increase net budget authority in the bill by $2 billion in fiscal year 2012 and a total of $5.5 billion over 10 years. Let me repeat that. That is adding $5.5 billion to the deficit. And I have in my hand here the CBO estimate of the budgetary effects of Amendment 575 to H.R. 1, CBO document. The House Rules Package adopted at the beginning of this Congress in House Resolution 5 includes the following rule in Section 3J3, and I quote, "It shall not be in order to consider an amendment to a general appropriations bill proposing a net increase in budget authority in the bill," end quote. According to the CBO estimate, the Rehberg amendment does, in fact, produce a net increase in budget authority and is therefore not in order. The majority have raised a point of order on all other amendments that violate this rule in Section 3J3 because they increase net budget authority. Yet, on this amendment by Mr. Rehberg, that is not the case. It would seem that on the question of health care, the majority is not abiding by its own rules to reduce the deficit. I ask a ruling from the chair.
Member wishes to be heard on the point of order.
Mr. Chair, I wish to be heard on the point of order.
Gentleman from Montana is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I have been advised by the chairman of the Committee of Budget that my amendment complies with all applicable rules of the House. The point of order that my amendment violates Clause 10 of Rule 21, known as the cut-go rule, is inapplicable in this case. The cut-go rule does provide a point of order against amendments to appropriations bills that cause an increase in mandatory spending over the 5-year scoring window. However, that rule contains an important exception. The point of order applies only to provisions that are modifications to substantive law. My amendment does not constitute such a modification. Rather, it is a temporary provision limiting the use of funds in this Act for the implementation of the law in a particular fiscal year. As the chairman of the Committee on the Budget stated, my amendment does not make a modification to substantive law in the year after the year for which the bill makes appropriations. Accordingly, the prohibition contained in Clause 10 of Rule 21 does not apply to my amendment, and the point of order should be overruled, and I respectfully ask the chair for a ruling.
Does anyone else wish to be heard on the point of order? Gentleman
Mr.
from
Chairman,
New
I
Jersey.
wish to be heard on the point of order.
Gentleman is recognized.
The gentlelady from Connecticut's point of order should be sustained, and frankly, the chairman's arguments are deficient in two respects. First, he notes that the chairman of the Budget Committee's opinion is that the point of order should not be sustained. Although I realize that the chairman of the Budget Committee's opinion by custom is given some sort of special gravity on these kind of questions, with all due respect, the chair is the chair. The chair is the authority here, and the chair's responsibility is to follow the rules of the House, which very clearly state that a piece of legislation has a net increase in budget authority is out of order under these circumstances. Secondly, the chairman makes the argument that this is not a change in substantive law. One first would wonder why it's then being offered, but secondly, it seems to me that if agents of the executive branch have a responsibility, and that responsibility includes discretion as to how to carry out a certain law, prohibiting them from carrying out that responsibility and limiting their discretion is in fact a significant change in substantive law. On those grounds, I would urge that the point of order be sustained.
Is there any other member wish to be heard on the point of order? Ma'am, just the gentleman from New Jersey first.
Okay, gentleman, go ahead. No, you go.
For what purpose do you rise? You are recognized.
I just find it incredible what I'm hearing on the other side of the aisle here, because, you know, we've gone through several weeks now where basically the rules have been changed so that the Budget Committee chairman basically does whatever he pleases and, you know, it has the authority almost like equal to the rest of the House, the way the Republicans have given him this authority. You know, it's sort of like a one-man dictatorship. So I'm not sure that I'm particularly interested in his opinion on this one. But beyond that, and I'll follow up on my colleague from New Jersey, when you talk about substantive changes to the law, the whole purpose of this amendment is to basically gut the health care reform and make sure that it never takes place. And if it were to become law, if it were to be adopted, that is exactly what would happen. So this has a major substantive impact. And beyond that, what we're highlighting here is the fact that here we have the Republicans saying that they're trying to save money or cut spending, when in reality what they're doing with this amendment is increasing the deficit and actually making it more difficult to create jobs. So I don't see how we could ever argue, frankly, that this amendment is in order. It clearly increases the deficit. It clearly increases the budget authority. It will kill the health care reform, and that's its purpose. So I would ask that the chairman rule that this is certainly out of order.
Anyone else wish to be heard on the rule? Gentlelady from Connecticut.
Yes, Mr. Chairman, I'd like to make a comment on the point of order. The chairman has argued, with all due respect to the chairman, that the amendment does not violate Clause 10 of Rule 21. But that is not the point of order that I raised. The point of order was Section 3J3 of HRES 5. And I'll repeat what that says. It shall not be in order to consider an amendment to the General Appropriations Bill proposing a net increase in budget authority in the bill. It clearly proposes an increase. And we have the documentation from CBO. So I'm asking that this amendment be ruled out of order.
Thank you. Lady yields back. Is there anyone else who wishes to be heard on the point of order?
Respond.
Gentleman from Montana.
It doesn't matter which clause they want to draw from. The chairman said there is no impact. My amendment scores at a savings of $100 million in the current fiscal year. That's substantive savings, and I again ask for a ruling from the chair.
Chair is prepared to rule. Is there any other discussion to the point of order? If not, the gentlewoman from Connecticut makes a point of order that the amendment offered by the gentleman from Montana violates Section 3J3 of House Resolution 5. Section 3J3 establishes a point of order against an amendment proposing a net increase in budget authority in the bill. The Chair has been persuasively guided by an estimate from the Chair of the Committee of Budget that the amendment does not propose a net increase in budget authority in fiscal year 2011, the relevant fiscal year for this bill. The point of order is overruled. Pursuant to the order of the House of February 17, 2011, the gentleman from Montana, Mr. Rehberg, and a member opposed will each control 30 minutes. The chairman recognizes the gentleman from Montana.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I ask for as much time as I may consume.
Gentleman is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, my amendment is simple and straightforward. This amendment denies any funding provided by this bill to be used by the department or agency funded through the Labor HHS title of the bill to support Obamacare. It will create a firewall so that funds from this bill cannot be used for that purpose. Obamacare included mandatory funding for several provisions normally funded through the discretionary appropriations. For example, $1 billion implementation fund. So unfortunately, resources will be available to Health and Human Services. This amendment can slow but not completely stop the process. I've tried everything within my power to write an amendment that would completely defund implementation, yet withstand a point of order. This is the best I can do today. I liken the situation with this bill to trying to drive a car to the moon. A car is the wrong vehicle for that purpose, but a car can take us on the first leg of the trip. It can get us to the launching pad, and I will continue to do everything I can to finish the journey. My goal, and the goal of the majority of Americans, is to repeal the new health care law. Until then, my objective is to defund it entirely and stop its implementation. It's impossible at this time to describe the many reasons that justify defunding and repeal. Let me begin with my belief that the law is unconstitutional. It runs contrary to our most fundamental concepts of limited government and individual liberty and responsibility. It's a law designed by those who wish to control every health care decision made by health care providers and patients, by every employer and employee, by every family and individual. It will control every aspect of 1/6 of our economy. This unaffordable program will cost $2.6 trillion in the first 10 years if fully implemented. 90% of that cost is for Medicaid expansion and insurance subsidies. Roughly half of the federal government's costs will be paid through new taxes, penalties, and fees on individuals and businesses. The other half is covered by cuts in Medicare benefits. The tax increases and regulatory burdens will be a significant drag on economic growth and job creation, and other costs to states, businesses, and individuals are not included in the $2.6 trillion figure. This is a job killer. How foolhardy. To create a new entitlement program when we cannot pay for the ones we already have and cannot meet our current operating expenses without borrowing beyond our ability to repay, this is madness. The structure of this bill is built on a foundation of multiple mandates. The individual mandate that requires people to purchase insurance whether they want to or not. Mandates on states to create and operate insurance exchanges and to expand Medicaid dramatically. Mandates on employers to provide insurance or be penalized. Mandates regarding the precise terms of insurance policies that everyone ultimately must purchase. And on and on. Our forefathers would be appalled to see the power over our health and lives that we are surrendering to government. They had firsthand experience with unfettered government control, and they carefully designed a Constitution to limit the government's power. We've learned nothing from them. Never has there been such a complete transfer of power to our government, with such blind faith and hope that government will get it right, when our experience in every other context is so totally to the contrary. This is an experiment, a huge gamble imposed on us by those who did not read the legislation or fully understand its consequences. We're already catching glimpses of how government power will be exercised. Large corporations and unions have been granted waivers for mandates they cannot meet. Large corporations with armies of lawyers and unions who hold a special place in the hearts, minds, and political campaigns of those who enacted this bill. Will government be so accommodating to you? There are problems with the existing health care system, but this law only makes matters worse. The law must be repealed so that it can be replaced with incremental, market-oriented, affordable measures to improve rather than transform our current health care system. In the meantime, implementation must be stopped. There's a second reason to defund implementation. The law's individual mandate has been declared unconstitutional by 2 federal judges. Judge Roger Vinson has written a powerful opinion that strikes down the entire law. The administration and Congress are on notice of the substantial risk that the Supreme Court will uphold Vinson's decision. If that occurs after a year of litigation, billions of dollars spent by the federal government to implement the law and by states, businesses, individuals, and taxpayers to comply with the law will have been completely wasted, thrown away. In light of the crisis created by our ballooning debt and anemic economy, it's fiscally irresponsible to go forward with implementation until the court challenge is finally resolved. For these reasons, I urge you to support my amendment, and I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman reserves who seeks time in opposition.
I seek time in opposition.
Gentlelady is recognized. You will control 30 minutes.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, I yield myself 5 minutes. The American people want us to work together to address their top priorities, creating jobs, turning the economy around, and reducing the deficit. The Republican majority told the American people, vote for me. That's what we are going to do. This is a classic case of bait and switch. Their first order of business was to repeal health care reform, the results of which would add to unemployment, add to the deficit, and delay the economic recovery. And today, by denying funds for the implementation of health care, they are at it again. This amendment would take away the consumer protections of the Affordable Care Act, put the insurance companies back in charge, a further demonstration of the majority's special interest priorities and their hypocrisy on job creation and deficit reduction. Repealing health care will destroy jobs in the health professions. It will slow growth by 250,000 to 400,000 jobs a year. It will increase medical spending and add nearly $2,000 to the average family insurance premium. And according to CBO, repeal would add $230 billion to the deficit in the first 10 years and $1 trillion in the second 10 years. And let me repeat that. This amendment adds billions and ultimately trillions of dollars to the deficit, and it starts next year with $2.2 billion. And what my colleague will say that in the rest of this year, that isn't the case. One needs to just look at what the CBO said overall on the $5.5 billion in deficit that this would create. This is not what they promised the American people. This amendment will allow insurers to charge women 48% more than men for exactly the same coverage. It allows insurance companies to once again discriminate against Americans with pre-existing conditions, even children with pre-existing conditions. Women may again be denied coverage because they survived breast cancer, or because they were a victim of domestic violence, or because they had a C-section. It will deny up to 4 million small businesses $40 billion in tax credits. This amendment will increase drug costs for seniors. It will take away the 50% discount on brand-name drugs for those who have found themselves in the donut hole. It will increase also seniors' health care costs, making life-saving preventive services like mammograms, colonoscopies, wellness visits, blood pressure screenings, and diabetes screenings more expensive. This amendment will cost money, and it will cost lives. In Connecticut, 191,000 children with pre-existing conditions benefit from the health care reform law. More than 540,000 seniors with Medicare coverage no longer have out-of-pocket expenses for recommended preventive services, and up to 15,400 small businesses in my district alone will benefit from these tax credits. If this amendment passes, what will happen to children with pre-existing conditions, to seniors in the donut hole, to small business owners trying to help their employees find quality health insurance? I urge my colleagues to vote against this irresponsible amendment, and I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentlelady reserves. Gentleman from Montana.
I'm pleased to yield 2 minutes to my good friend from Texas, Mr. Burgess. 5 minutes.
Gentleman from Texas is recognized for 5 minutes.
I thank the gentleman for yielding. And as
was so eloquently put forward by Mr. Rehberg, the chairman of the Subcommittee on Health and Human Services Appropriations just a moment ago. This is a temporary limiting amendment on the appropriations for implementation of the Patient Protection Affordable Care Act. Bait and switch. That term was used by the other side just a moment ago in their arguments. Bait and switch. Think back to where we were just a little over a year ago in this House of Representatives when the Democrats' version of a health care bill passed. Where is that bill today? Somewhere in the dustbin out in the halls outside the office that the former Speaker now occupies. Bait and switch. What happened on Christmas Eve of last year, of 2009? The Senate passed a bill that was never intended to become law. It was a placeholder. It was a vehicle to simply get the senators home for Christmas Eve ahead of a snowstorm so that then everyone could come back to the Capitol in January of 2010 and work on the bill that would ultimately become President Obama's health care reform. But it didn't happen. The Democrats lost an election in Massachusetts for the Senate seat. And that changed the paradigm, that changed the narrative, that changed the debate. And then, what happened? The House took up the bill passed by the Senate, conveniently a bill that had been passed by the House of Representatives the summer before as a housing bill, H.R. 3590. Look it up on Thomas at home if you doubt. 3590 passed the Senate. Why would Senator Reid, why would the other body take up a previously passed House bill and turn it into a health care bill? Because it wasn't a health care bill. It was a tax bill. It was a tax bill that had, by constitutional authority, had to originate in the House of Representatives. So then the other body had the perfect vehicle. Take this housing bill, strip out the housing language, put in the health care language, pass it on Christmas Eve, and then we'll all gather back after the New Year's Eve festivities and create a conference committee and pass the President's signature health care legislation. But it didn't happen that way. And then the elimination of opponents on the Democratic side began in sequential form, such that by March 23rd of last year, enough Democrats had changed their votes and would support the Senate-passed House bill. And the question, will the House now agree to the Senate amendment on 3590? Well, it's answered affirmatively. But was that the end of the story? No. This was extensively litigated in the political arena last fall. And what was the judgment of the American people after the litigation in the political arena? The answer was, we don't want it. We don't want any part of it. Fix it. Do something. So Chairman Rehberg is doing exactly that today, within the limits that he is constrained by in a continuing resolution. He is providing the vehicle, the floor, by which the implementation of this very flawed process, this very flawed piece of this very flawed law can now be contained. It was important before, but 3 weeks ago it became critical. It became critical because of Judge Vinson's ruling. And why is that? And I encourage my colleagues to go to Judge Vinson's ruling. It's available on the Internet. It's not hard to read. It's about 75 pages. Judge Vinson's ruling, page 76 of 78, because the individual mandate is unconstitutional and not severable, the entire act must be declared void. Pretty clear language. Now, why is it necessary to approach the funding? Because earlier in his opinion, Judge Vinson observed that there is a long-standing presumption that officials of the executive branch will adhere to the law as declared by the court. As a result, declaratory judgment is the functional equivalent of an injunction. Well, that should be good enough for members of the executive branch, the heads of federal agencies, but apparently that is not so, because what we see today in our committee hearings, in the headlines in the newspapers, is that this administration is proceeding at light speed with implementation. The previous health care czar is now the Deputy Chief of Staff in the White House. What does that tell you about their plans for implementation? In fact, the plans for implementation were going so fast that one of the chief architects of implementation was hired a month and a half before the bill was signed into law. And that's testimony that we heard in our Committee in Energy and Commerce this past week. I sent a letter to Secretary Sebelius this week asking her to provide for us what direction she was going to take in light of Judge Vinson's ruling. I'll submit that as for the record. But I thank the gentleman for bringing this limiting amendment to the floor today. It is critically important that this Congress act to limit the implementation of this very flawed health care law. Let's get back to the work the American people asked us to do in the election. And I'll yield back to the gentleman.
Gentleman's time has expired. The gentlewoman from Connecticut.
I yield 3 minutes to the gentleman from California, Mr. Miller.
Gentleman from California is recognized for 3 minutes.
Ask the unanimous consent to revise and extend my remarks.
Without objection, so ordered.
I thank the gentlewoman for yielding me this time. The author of this amendment said a few minutes ago that this was a very simple and straightforward amendment. And that's probably true for members of Congress who have government-paid health insurance, have policies that are looked after by people, make sure that we get benefits. But if you're a member of the American public, this is not a simple and straightforward amendment. If you're a member of the American public, this amendment changes your life for millions of Americans, and for millions of their children, for millions of their parents. This amendment changes their life. This isn't straightforward. So many of our new Republican colleagues have come to town and said, I'm just one of the folks back home. I'm not enamored with Washington. I'm just one of the folks back home. Vote for this amendment and you won't be like the folks back home. Vote for this amendment and you'll be very different than the folks back home, because you'll have insurance and they won't. You'll have coverage and they won't. You won't have lifetime caps and they will. You won't lose your insurance when you need it, for you, your children, or your spouse, but your constituents will. You're not just like the folks back home. You're doing grave damage to the folks back home. So you ought to think about this amendment before you vote for it. Not only does it add $5 billion almost immediately to the deficit, it adds $1 trillion to the deficit over 20 years, takes us in the wrong direction, but this punishes people back home. Talk to your constituents, who now, the seniors, who have that free physical checkup and have been given medicines and been told about things that they're doing wrong with respect to their health, and now can prevent additional doctor's visits and hospital care because of that checkup that they now get, that this amendment would take away. Talk to the parents, and you really ought to talk to the grandparents of the children who now have coverage that didn't have it before. They're as concerned about the coverage of their grandchildren as they are about their Medicare coverage, which you will change with respect to the cost of pharmaceuticals. No, this isn't simple and straightforward, and this isn't just like the folks back home. The folks back home are struggling every day to pay their insurance premiums. Pass this amendment, and once again the insurance companies can rip them off. Once again, they no longer have to dedicate 80% of your premiums to your health care. They can write themselves the bonuses, the advertising, the salaries, and forget the health care. There won't be that kind of protection for people who struggle every month to achieve health care coverage. For the 9 million people who are in the middle of getting rebates now because of the change in the law to make sure that health insurance companies provide you health insurance instead of a funding stream for the executives. No, this isn't simple and straightforward, and you're not just like the folks back home once you vote for this amendment. Is that clear?
Gentleman yields back.
Just want to make sure.
Gentleman from Montana.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. At this time, I'm pleased to grant 2 minutes to the new gentleman on the Appropriation Committee, a great addition, Mr. Graves from Georgia.
Gentleman from Georgia is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Rehberg. You know, just listening to what we just heard from our colleague across the aisle, he said, go back and talk to your doctors, talk to parents, talk to seniors. You're missing the point. It's time to listen. That's what we've been doing. We've been listening. And the American people in November said it's time not only to defund this, but to repeal this measure. Again, the House has moved forward to do such. So maybe you should quit talking to and start listening to. Mr. Chairman, I'm here in support of this amendment because, simply put, it defunds Obamacare bureaucrats. If this amendment is adopted, government bureaucrats cannot be paid so much as to lift a finger, move a paperclip, send an email if it has anything to do with Obamacare.
And for what? Does the gentleman yield for a parliamentary inquiry?
Sir, I'd rather just finish my comments here. They have plenty of time on their
The gentleman
side.
then is recognized. Come to you afterwards.
And since today we're here to talk about saving the taxpayer dollars,
Mr.
let's
Speaker,
remember the cost of
Obamacare. I don't believe a gentleman needs to yield for a
Gentleman will
parliamentary inquiry.
suspend for what purpose does the gentlelady from Florida rise?
For a parliamentary inquiry.
Pointer.
For a parliamentary inquiry.
Gentleman from Georgia must yield to before a parliamentary inquiry. The gentleman from Georgia is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So we're here today to talk about saving the taxpayers' money. Let's remember the cost of Obamacare. $2.6 trillion over the first 10 years once it's implemented. $560 billion in new taxes on American families and businesses. Unconstitutional mandates, higher premiums, and yes, lost coverage. The law is so damaging that the Obama administration themselves have granted at least 915 waivers for health plans and organizations. Now think about that, saving 2.5 million people from Obamacare. Mr. Chairman, let's save the rest of America here today, and let's support the Rehberg Amendment and move on and zero out the payments to those Obamacare bureaucrats. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman yields back. For what purpose does the gentlelady from Florida rise?
Mr. Speaker, is it a violation of the House rule wherein members are not permitted to make disparaging references to the President of the United States? In two previous gentlemen's statements on the amendment, both of them referred to the Affordable Care Act, which is the accurate title of the health care reform law, as Obamacare. That is a disparaging reference to the President of the United States. It is meant as a disparaging reference to the President of the United States, and it is clearly in violation of the House rules against that.
Gentlelady has stated a hypothetical. Chairman will not rule on a hypothetical, but will urge all members in this discussion to refrain from engaging in personalities or descriptions about personalities in general.
Thank you.
The gentlelady from Connecticut.
Mr. Speaker, I yield myself 30 seconds. To the prior gentleman, I would just say you didn't listen to the people of this country. You sold them a bill of goods. You told them you were going to create jobs, you were going to reduce the deficit, and you were going to turn the economy around. You have done none of this. You have been here 6 weeks, 8 weeks, and you have not done anything. And with this amendment, you will indeed, by the CBO numbers, increase the deficit as soon as next year by over $2 billion. With that, let me yield 3 minutes to the gentleman from New Jersey, Mr. Pallone.
New Jersey is recognized for 3 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. You know, how many times are we going to hear about repealing the health care reform instead of having an initiative that actually creates jobs? I go out, the gentleman from Georgia said, are you listening to your constituents? Yes, I listen to my constituents. They tell us we should address job creation and the economy, and not constantly argue over and over again about repealing health care reform, which we know is going absolutely nowhere. So when I listen, that's what I hear, jobs, the economy, not this constant repetition of repeal. Now, you know, I have a lot of respect for the gentleman from Montana, I have to say, but he talks about completely stopping and defunding implementation. Well, the reason that the Republicans are saying that and want to defund implementation because this health care reform is already working. Insurers now can't drop someone's coverage when they get sick. Seniors are saving money on prescription drugs. Young adults to 26 are getting back on their parents' insurance. And small businesses are receiving billions of dollars in tax credits to provide health care coverage. This is moving along. This is working. That's why they want to stop the implementation, because they know that it's working. Now, the defunding amendments will end all these benefits, putting health insurance companies back in charge of Americans' health care. The only person who benefits from defunding and repeal are the special interest health insurance companies that want to charge more and continue their discriminatory practices. The gentleman from Montana talked about the cost. Well, the fact of the matter is that if we pass these defunding amendments offered in the guise of budget austerity, they're actually one step towards repealing the largest deficit cutter passed in the last decade, and that's the Affordable Care Act. The health care reform helps tremendously in reducing the deficit.
It will save $230 billion over the next 10 years and over $1 trillion in the 10 years after that. If we defund health care reform, there will be no prohibition on discrimination against over 100 million Americans with pre-existing conditions, no prohibition on insurance companies canceling your coverage when you get sick, no prohibition on lifetime caps and annual limits, no required coverage for young adults on their parents' policies, no assistance to seniors struggling to afford the cost of drugs in the donut hole, and no free annual checkups in Medicare, no tax credits for families and small businesses to pay for health insurance. Repeal, and I stress, is a boon for the insurance companies, but an enormous setback for American families. If we pass this amendment, the insurance companies can raise their rates without review or transparency, they can deny coverage to millions of Americans with pre-existing conditions, and they can cut off coverage when someone becomes sick. I urge all members to vote no on these defunding amendments. The health care reform is working. I go back home and people are pleased with it because already, in many cases, they're able to get insurance they weren't able to get before. This, and I'm tired of hearing this over and over again, concentrate on jobs and the economy, not this charade.
Gentleman's time has expired. Gentleman from Montana.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield myself 1 minute.
So recognized.
I respectfully do refer to it as Obamacare. You would think that he would want his name attached to his signature legislation. But in 4 quick years, this Congress and this President has made what is a spending problem into a spending crisis. We wanted to create jobs. You wasted time on the health care reform that did not control the cost. They call it the affordable health care. Unfortunately, all it did was add people. It didn't control the cost of health care, and that's one of the reasons it needs to be repealed. We wanted to build an economy. They wanted to build government. So we call it what it is. It is Obamacare. It's a travesty. It is big government. It is not controlling health care costs, and it needs to be repealed. And today we're going to try and defund it to the best of our ability. And if we're not successful this time, we're going to try again and again and again until we either have a Senate that's willing to pass it or a President that understands that we cannot do this to the American people. At this time, I yield 5 minutes to my good friend from Iowa, Mr. King.
Gentleman from Iowa is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I thank the chairman of the Subcommittee of Appropriations on HHS, Congressman Rehberg, for yielding. And I want to declare my support for this amendment, and I think he's happy if I refer to it as the Rehberg Amendment. And I want to also thank Denny Rehberg for the work that he has done on this. You know, America will never know, Mr. Chairman, how much work went into crafting this amendment to get this fix that does a little bit to take us down the road. And boy, it is important to me to see $100 million cut out of the resources that would be used to implement Obamacare. And Mr. Chairman, I'm also very confident in declaring it to be Obamacare. I listened to President Obama address it as Obamacare on February 25th of last year at the Blair House during the Health Care Summit. I thought that was the source of the moniker Obamacare, was the President himself. And if anyone thinks otherwise, I think they should look back and check the record. Obamacare is this. It's not $1 trillion in deficit over 20 years if we don't go through with this atrocity. It's $2.6 trillion in spending in the first full decade, according to the chairman of the Budget Committee, Paul Ryan. $2.6 trillion in spending. We're here in this CR to cut spending. We know that we have to go into a national era of austerity because of the overspending that's taken place over the last 4 years in particular, and the last 2 years in a hugely significant way. We're looking at a budget now that's proposed, a deficit proposed by the President of $1.65 trillion. And if you roll back to the full federal outlays in 1997, $1.6 trillion. The on-budget items 2002, $1.6 trillion, and we have that much deficit proposed by the President. We want to shut off $2.6 trillion worth of irresponsible spending. We want to preserve the liberty and the freedom of the American people and the best health care system in the world. That's why you see Shakes planes landing in places like Rochester, Minnesota, to get health care that they can't get in other places in the world. If Michael Moore thinks Cuba has the best health care system, I suggest he swim there. This country, we need to preserve the system we have and expand it. The Rehberg Amendment helps slow down this implementation that is going on in an aggressive fashion by the Obama administration. Now, I happen to have in my hand Mr. Chairman. This is an excerpt from a CRS report that tells you how duplicitous this bill read once one picked it up and read it. The 2,500 pages. And in here are multiple places, over 50 places, where Obamacare actually not just authorizes, but it also appropriates. Not completely unprecedented, but it is the largest, most substantial effort to trigger automatic spending that goes on in perpetuity, Mr. Chairman. The number here is not $100 billion. The number on this CRS report is $105.5 billion over the next 10 years. And in the balance of this fiscal year, it's $4.95 billion that we're having trouble getting at. Thanks to Denny Rehberg, we're getting at $100 million. And I believe this amendment will pass today, and it will go on this CR, and it will become a significant leverage point over in the United States Senate. Other components of this that need to be ripped out. Now, oh, wait a minute, I forgot to remind you, again, H.R. 2, full repeal of Obamacare. I was pleased to see language that I had worked on and drafted for all those months went over to the Senate, where every Republican voted to repeal Obamacare. Here we had bipartisan support for the repeal of Obamacare, 3 times the bipartisan support described by then Speaker Nancy Pelosi. And we sat here now with America that has 2/3 of them by the polling has rejected Obamacare. In this bill, another piece that reads deceptively is this: the authority for the Secretary of Health and Human Services to do interdepartmental transfers in any amount greater than the 2008 budget bill, which means slush funds all through that department to aggressively implement Obamacare. The Rehberg Amendment shuts off some of that, probably not all of that, but it gets at it and it lays the point out, and I hope that we can do better on some of the others into the future. We also need to understand that when America has rejected a piece of legislation that so upsets all of our lives and takes away so much of our liberty and freedom, takes away our ability to buy a health insurance policy that is high deductible, high co-payment, and low premium, that we have many more good solutions that will unfold here. This bill is unconstitutional in 4 places at least. 2 federal courts have ruled so. We know that it will eventually get to the Supreme Court. And we can never say with certainty what the result will be, but we know the certainty of the 2 federal courts, Mr. Chairman, and we must have the Rehberg Amendment so the American people are dealt with the respect and honor of their justice and their opinion. H.R. 1 cuts the funding, H.R. 2 repealed. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I thank the gentleman from Montana, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentlelady from Connecticut.
Let me just reiterate again. This amendment would not create jobs. It would not do anything to reduce the deficit. In fact, by the CBO numbers, it would increase net budget authority in the bill by $2 billion next year, a total of $5.5 billion over the next several years. It increases the deficit. Let's keep hitting it on that point. Mr. Levin of Michigan is recognized for 2 minutes.
Without objection, unanimous consent is granted, and the gentleman from Michigan is recognized for 2 minutes.
If this amendment would become part of the CR, there'll be no CR. And that will be your responsibility. Your responsibility. This is an effort to repeal by paralysis, paralyzing the provisions that have gone into effect. Pre-existing conditions for children being covered, children under 26 having the ability to get insurance. It would paralyze the efforts to begin to implement the 2014 benefits. Instead of searching for common ground, this amendment intensifies warfare. Instead of collaboration, this amendment would mean chaos. The Republicans have become a wrecking crew, led by Paul Ryan and wrecking Medicare. This amendment is a deeply dangerous prescription for Americans' health. This prescription needs to be rejected. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The gentleman from Montana.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I yield myself 1 minute. Does anybody honestly believe in America that by repealing Obamacare it's actually going to cost the government money? It just doesn't pass the smell test. Yes, the way the CBO is scoring it based upon the questions that they are asked show it is, but nobody, honestly, nobody in this country honestly believes that when you repeal a piece of legislation, it's going to end up costing you money. At this time, I'd like to yield 5 minutes to one of the few people that clearly gets the entire picture, a doctor, one of our members from the state of Georgia, Mr. Price, who understands that defensive medicine was entirely left out of this, but of course we know why, and it's one of the issues that is driving the cost of health care. 5 minutes to Mr. Price.
Gentleman from Georgia is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank my friend. I appreciate him for his remarkable leadership on this. Many of us tried to figure out how we could bring this issue to the fore under this bill, and you have done that. Our friends on the other side of the aisle talk about jobs. This won't create any jobs. Well, I'll tell you some jobs that this will save if we pass this amendment, and that's the physicians of this land. As a physician, and if folks in this body talk to their doctors back home, they will understand the remarkable challenges and the number of physicians who are throwing up their hands and saying, I can't handle the hassles anymore. I can't believe the intrusion of the federal government into my ability to take care of my patients in the way that I deem best. And so what are they saying? They're saying, well, there isn't any way for me to uphold and live by the oath that I took to do what was best for my patients, and therefore I'm left in a remarkable moral quandary. And for many of them, it is to say, I'm sorry, I'm no longer able to practice under this oppressive government. The deficit, that's right, we ought to be talking about the deficit. Here's the track right here of the folks who've been in charge for the last 4 years. In 2006, they came in, this is what the federal government was spending down here, a little over $2.6 trillion. The last year of their reign, they're up in the $3.7, $3.8 trillion range. The deficit is about a third of that. Now, this year coming up, $1.6 trillion. So, Mr. Chair, to have our friends on the other side of the aisle tell us about deficit is a bit curious. I'm reminded by my friend from Texas, a fellow physician who gave a remarkable recitation of the history of the law that we have in place now, the non-health care reform law that was enacted. And I'm reminded of the jubilation on the other side of the aisle when they passed this piece of legislation last March. And at the time I had some serious conversations with friends on the other side because we weren't allowed to have this kind of robust debate. That wasn't allowed. It wasn't allowed in committee. It wasn't allowed on the floor of the House. The decisions had been made beforehand, and the bill was shoved down the throat of the House of Representatives and the American people. But I remember talking with them, and I remember saying, it's puzzling to me why you're so enthusiastic and excited about this. There's no way that this law can go forward because it is clearly unconstitutional. And in fact, now we've seen a court in Virginia, federal court in Virginia, and a federal court in Florida agree that the individual mandate, that the notion that the federal government can say to the American people by virtue of being a citizen, you must purchase this product and this is exactly what it must be. And that's what the law has done. And so I believe that before we will hold another election in this country, this law will be determined to be unconstitutional. Which really is a shame because we will have missed a great opportunity. My friend from Michigan who talked about bipartisan cooperation, of which there was none over the last 4 years in this arena. But we have missed a great opportunity, and hopefully we'll be able to enhance the opportunities that we have over the coming 2 years to be able to work together in a bipartisan way to address the challenges in health care. Because the status quo, as a physician and as a member of Congress, the status quo is clearly unacceptable. But when you look at the principles of health care, accessibility, making certain that people have accessibility to health care, which they don't right now, and which this law actually harms, affordability, which is becoming more and more of a challenge to the American people, and which this law actually harms. If you don't believe it, just ask the employees in businesses across this land who are having to pay higher premiums because of this law. The quality issues, all of the quality sorts of things that we all believe in so strongly, and which this law actually harms, because the only person who knows what's quality health care for you, decision-making power from you and your family and your physician, and it replaces it with folks here in town. who believe they know best what kind of health care you ought to receive. And then the responsiveness of the system and innovation in the system and choices, Mr. Chairman, choices that have been remarkably limited and will continue to be limited by this law. So what Mr. Rehberg has done here has said the only way that we can begin to dismantle this, which is what the American people desire in significant numbers, majority numbers, is to say you can't use resources that you have in your department to implement the law itself. And if the states and the federal government would listen to the judge in Florida, Judge Vinson in Florida, then they would realize that that, in fact, is their responsibility. It is their responsibility not to implement this law. So I urge adoption of the amendment, and I encourage my colleagues to get to work on the principles of health care, which this law absolutely ignores.
Gentleman's time has expired. Gentlelady from Connecticut.
The Rehberg amendment would increase net budget authority in the bill by $2 billion in fiscal